as a way of beginning to think about the whole notion of leadership in our community, we've asked our speakers this morning to present some of their personal ideas, thoughts, frameworks for the way in which we begin to think about Jewish leadership in its context. We're kind of dwelling this day on Jewish leadership in its context, both past and present, the ways in which we have conceived of community in Judaism and the way in which community plays itself out in our current community endeavors. Tomorrow we're going to be looking more at personal leadership, the skills and the qualities and the capacities we need to bring to the field. And on the last day we'll be talking particularly about leadership in our communities, what we can take back home, what are the things we need to think about as we move forward after Thursday into the work we do in our own home communities. One of the big discussions that we had early on was, is this a particular time in which things are really rapidly changing? Are we on, if you like, on the edge of something? And we've called this session Living on the Edge. Are we on the edge of something? We saw many great changes in Jewish history. We've seen how Jewish life has changed radically over time. But are we at a moment in time, and we may not be able to see it because we're in the middle of it, but is something rapidly changing around us? And is that going to have an impact upon the kind of synagogue communities and the kind of Jewish community that we all are familiar with now, but may be radically different in a short period of time? We know changes around us very much, and how is it impacting on our community? So to begin to think about those three things, we're going to ask our three speakers to talk about it first. They each have about 15 to 20 minutes each, and then we'll just take, if there's any clarification questions, we'll take those very, very briefly, just to make sure everyone feels comfortable with what's been heard. And then we're going to break out into breakout groups to really tackle some of this detail in the groups that you have. Each group will have a focus and will be asked to make some notes about your discussions. We'll bring those notes back and we will be able to look at each other's work from the breakout group. So I'll explain that a bit later. So I just want to introduce the three people who are sitting next to me. Rabbi, I've promoted you already. Keith Kahn-Harris is a friend and colleague. Keith has an article in this document and has also produced a new book, which has, this is the preview copy, the only one that exists so far. It's called Turbulent Times, The British Jewish Community Today.
It's co-written.
Co-written with Ben Gidley. Keith is an honorary research fellow at the Centre for Religion and Contemporary Society at Baeck College, and the convener of a forum, an online forum called New Jewish Thought. And this is the new book that's coming out this year, and is very interesting. Let me also, while I'm doing it, introduce our speakers who will be with us for the whole 3 days. Rabbi David Wolfman, delighted to welcome, flown in from Boston to be with us. He is the director of the North American Commission for Rabbinic Congregational Relations, which is a commission of the American Reform Movement, along with the Conference of American Rabbis, Reform Rabbis, so works as the liaison, as the partnership between congregations and rabbis throughout North America. And he has also been involved in studying and teaching around the topics of mediation and negotiation. And Justin Wise, known to many of us, is a consultant, facilitator, and a coach with what's called the Bridge Partnership, his own endeavor to bring this work to communities here in Britain. He has his own practice, and he works with leaders throughout the country and abroad, and particularly with the European Space Agency, and he trains people to be professional coaches. He's, like all of us actually, a parent. We all bring that to bear to our leadership as well, our parental leadership. Finally, just to, as a word of introduction, just to thank those people who were enabled us to think about the program and bring this whole program to fruition. So my colleagues who were part of the planning, Rabbi Richard Jacobi, Gabby Rupin, Paul Glicker, who is going to be joining us later this afternoon, and particularly to Maddie Turner, who I think you've all met and been emailing with, who has been the background voice. And if there's anything you need in terms of logistics, any assistance you need, please feel free to talk to Maddie, who's probably next door setting up for the next thing. So, to that end, I'm going to start with Keith, who will give his opening as to this whole issue of community and leadership.
Okay, so Michael asked about change. How has the Jewish community changed? Are we on the cusp of something quite major? And I would say yes, we are going through a period of major and largely positive change in the British Jewish community. The period which we talk about in the book is the last 20 or so years, from 1990 to around now. And during that time there's been significant processes of renewal, even of renaissance, within the British Jewish community. There's been new generations of leaders emerging. There have been new Jewish day schools built, substantial capital investments in the Jewish future. There's been limud coming from being a marginal aspect of the Jewish community to being absolutely the centre of its creativity and innovation. There's been significant changes in the role of arts and culture in British Jewry. From what was once seen as a fairly Philistine community, we have a community that is able to support a large range of arts, cultural and adult education projects. And I would argue that this, as we argue in the book, that this change was stimulated in part by fears that arose in the early 90s and late 80s. Fears that the British Jewish community was disappearing. Fear that the rate of intermarriage and assimilation was such that, as the chief rabbi put it in his 1994 book, Will We Have Jewish Grandchildren? And those fears led to a diagnosis that British Jewish life was too dull, too Philistine, that lacked innovation, that lacked quality leaders. And whilst a lot of the changes that we've seen have roots that go that are actually quite deep and that go way before 1990, a lot of things happened since then. But there are a couple of paradoxes in this process of change. The first paradox is that the flourishing and renewal of British Jewish life has taken place alongside an increase in publicly articulated concerns about anti-Semitism. The way we explain this paradox is that there's been a fundamental shift by the Jewish leadership to adapt to multicultural Britain, a shift to a strategy of leadership that is appropriate for a shift from a monocultural society that we were seen to be living in the earlier 20th century to what is now a multicultural society. And that shift is from a strategy of what we call a strategy of security to a strategy of insecurity. In the early 20th century, British Jewish leadership tried to emphasise to British Jews that they should be grateful to be British, that they should not rock the boat, that they should be good British citizens, and that they should feel secure in Britain. And the British Jewish leadership tried to persuade the British public and the British government, the British leadership, that British Jews were secure here and thus posed no threat. This strategy was shown to be anachronistic as the 20th century wore on, and now we are living in a time where the Jewish community leadership is unabashed about talking about its fears of anti-Semitism, but also its fears about assimilation. And so both this increased public concern about anti-Semitism and the Jewish Renaissance renewal are both part of the same overall trend. The second paradox that we talk about is that British Jewish life has been renewed despite the fact that many of the major deep-seated anachronisms, divisions and weaknesses in the community remain unreformed. We still have a Board of Deputies that does not appropriately represent British Jewry. We still have a chief rabbinate. We still have a majority of British Jews belonging to a synagogue who choose to join a synagogue, belonging to a synagogue movement, the United Synagogue, that does not reflect their views. You still have a United Synagogue that is nominally modern Orthodox, but whose religious leadership, whose Beth Din, is essentially dominated by Haredi Judaism. Now, if you went back to 1990 and said to a lot of people like me, to academics and critics of the Jewish community, what needs to change for Jewish life in Britain to be renewed, they would say, we need to change the Board of Deputies, we need to change the Chief Rabbinate or abolish it, we need to change the United Synagogue. None of these things have happened, and yet the Jewish life in Britain has been renewed. And that, I think, gives a strong lesson that unreformed conservative establishments need not prevent radical change. Structures can be outwardly protected, but its functions renewed. So you may have an organisation like the United Synagogue, which seemed essentially moribund and was financially bankrupt in the early 90s, but the United Synagogue has, despite everything, managed to renew itself and is a much more innovative, dynamic organisation, despite everything. We can point to projects such as its Tribe Youth Project in that respect. So to summarise, the British Jewish community was provoked by the insecurity of Jewish life in Britain to change. But it managed to find a way to provoke radical change in a way that was outwardly, if not inwardly, consistent with what is seen to be tradition. So, in the face of that, what are the principal challenges that the Jewish community faces? And I'm just going to list them briefly. Can I have a pen? I'll put them on the thing there. These aren't the only challenges, of course, but these seem to me to be the most salient and important.
There you
go. Okay. So the first one is survival. Ever since it became possible to not be a Jew, ever since people became free to assimilate in the 18th and 19th century, Judaism has faced a constant challenge. Why be Jewish? Why stay Jewish when there is a choice not to? And that is always going to be a problem, or an issue, or maybe even an opportunity. And Jews have to have a good reason why be Jewish, why stay Jewish. It's all very well to say we're disappearing, we're intermarrying, we're assimilating, but all that's worthless unless you say there's a reason why be Jewish. Related to that is the challenge of demography. Now, in part, that's a challenge to do with assimilation and intermarriage, and by the way, I don't necessarily buy the argument that intermarriage is always a disaster and that intermarriage always creates assimilation. However, it certainly creates issues in the Jewish community. And demographically, there is no doubt we are an ageing community. There are less children being born than there are people dying. However, it's possible that the Jewish community in Jewish population in Britain may be stabilising, but one of the reasons why major reasons, if not the only reason why it may be stabilising, again, there's a lot of controversy over that, is the growth of the Haredi community, where people have massive families. And the growth of the Haredi community is a major challenge to the future of British Jewry. As they become a bigger percentage of British Jewry, it has all sorts of implications for welfare, for representation, for other things. Another demographic challenge is the growth of the Israeli Jewish community. Israel is either just become it or is shortly about to become the world's largest Jewish community. The likelihood is the proportion of Israeli Jews compared to diaspora Jews is only going to grow. And that has all sorts of interesting and some positive and some less positive consequences for the global Jewish world. There are also other demographic changes related to family and employment structure. Late marriage, women working, which wasn't so common 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. All of those has implications. And I'm not going to go into all those implications, but when we're thinking about the future of the Jewish community, demography and wider issues about population structure have to be part of it. And demography is difficult to think about because it can often be incredibly dry, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't think about it. Third challenge is community. And part of this is the challenge of how you retain a sense of Jewish community, a sense of peoplehood against the inescapable fact that Jews are very different. One of the 2001 census, for the first time, contained a question that allowed people to self-identify as Jewish. And when the data was analysed by the Institute of Jewish Policy Research a few years ago, one of their major conclusions was that we are a heterogeneous people, right? We come from all different classes, we come from all different parts of the country, except for one place. What's the one place where they couldn't find any Jews? No, it was the Ciliars. The Ciliars. Well, someone told me yes. I've heard that before. You found the Ciliars Jew. We are Haredi. We are not Haredi. We are Reform. We are Orthodox. We are single parents. We are large families. We are early marriage. We are late marriage. And yes, we have certain concentrations, like in the northwest London and South Hertfordshire, but we are everywhere. And so and there's another dimension of difference as well, which is in terms of opinion. We are Orthodox and non-Orthodox. We are Zionist and non-Zionist and anti-Zionist. We are critics of Israel and supporters of Israel. We are all sorts of things. So how do you retain a sense of community and peoplehood against these sharp divisions? I should also say Orthodox Reform as well. And that's a case not just simply in terms of difference between Reform and Orthodox and so on, but also within the Reform movement itself and within the liberal movement as well. How do you balance the desire to create a common ideology, a common theology in the Reform movement with the need to attend to the fact that it's a community, that people have different views? And, for example, how do you ensure that Reform communities are able to have a consistent position on women, on the involvement of women, while still respecting the fact that people come from very different spaces? So on the position of women, the Reformed Jewish community has largely taken people with it, but there may be other issues that are much more divisive, such as, for example, gay marriage and things like that. Another challenge to community is secularism versus religion. Secularism is a growing trend. Religion is also a commitment as well. How do you balance those within a concern for Jewish peoplehood? And finally, this is Shoshana's big issue, is post-denominationalism. How do you balance the desire for people to flit between different movements, to learn to gain the best from every stream of Judaism, with the desire to create a Reform movement, or an Orthodox movement for that matter? Needless to say, I'm not offering you answers for that, but these are the big challenges that we face. Another challenge, education. We are currently in the process of a massive change in British Jewish community. It used to be, certainly when I was growing up, and that's not that long ago, I'm 38, it was a minority of Jewish children went to Jewish schools. Now it's becoming the majority, and it's becoming an ever-increasing majority. That has all sorts of implications. It has implications for synagogues, as Hedarim are in some synagogues dying. As you so what happens to synagogues then? Although the recent High Court ruling, Supreme Court ruling, has, in the short term at least, created opportunities for synagogues, in the sense that you often need to join a synagogue in order to go to a Jewish day school. That creates problems and also opportunities. The rise of day schools has opportunities and problems for the idea of what it means to be an educated community. So there are all sorts of issues there. Final challenge that I want to talk about is sustainability. And again, this has several facets to it. One is the recession. How do we survive this recession? We've currently undergoing some major capital projects. The new Jewish Community Centre in London, JCOS, all require enormous sums of money from the Jewish community, and there have been warnings for years from the JPR and for other people, from other organisations, saying we are relying too much on a few major donors. We haven't spread the financial responsibility in the Jewish community properly. And how are these major programs going to survive in a position where people have less and less income, particularly given that the Jewish community, self-employed people, business owners, are overrepresented in the Jewish community, and if they're in trouble, then we might be in trouble too. But another aspect of sustainability is, of course, ecological, environmental sustainability, which is an issue that has not, in my view, become far enough up the issue of priorities in the list of priorities in the Jewish community. It's something that we're still fairly shockingly bad at. I'll give one example. and this is where Chatham House rules apply. Until recently, the reform movement had had one senior member of staff who essentially commuted from Israel, coming once a month. Is that an appropriate thing to do in this day and age? And more generally, the issue of environmental, is it appropriate to bring thousands of Jews to and from Israel all the time? And how are ecological challenges going to affect Israel and therefore affect the entire Jewish community? How is the fact that this is an area with a very high population growth rate, with few natural resources, with rising temperatures, with increasing competition for water amongst the Middle Eastern states, how's that going to affect Israel? And if it affects Israel in negative ways, then it will affect us as well. So issues of sustainability may seem quite far away and quite beside the point to issues of the Jewish future, but they're there and they're real. All right, so what's the master challenge, the challenge that covers all of these 5 aspects? And I would argue that the major challenge is how to provide the comfort, the security, the joy of community, of Jewish peoplehood, the feeling of belonging, without being too comfortable, without being too secure. What was quite clear is that in the 80s, 70s, 60s, the Jewish community probably was too secure. It felt too comfortable, and that alienated a lot of the more cutting-edge people. Now we're doing well. More interesting, innovative people have a place in the Jewish community that they may not have had before. But how do we make the Jewish community a place for innovation, a place for change, a place that's dynamic, while at the same time making it also a place that is home? So I've raised a huge number of questions there. If you want to know some of the answers, then they're in the book. But actually, these are questions that are going to have to be asked for years to come, whether in my book or wherever. And I hope that the questions don't make people too insecure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.